Hi there, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to you wherever you are in the world. Today, we're reporting in from London and Seattle to give you another episode in the latest news and developments in digital credentials and self-sovereign identity. My name's Andy Tobin, and I've got a couple of illustrious colleagues that I'll introduce to you shortly. For those who are new to our Evernym webinars, and this is by far the biggest one we've done to date. We run these regularly to inform and educate people and help you understand what self-sovereign identity and digital credentials are all about. In the last webinar we covered the business models and incentives that could be created in digital credential ecosystems. There's lots of excitement about the technology, but it's worth nothing unless you can actually get it deployed and understand what it's going to do for your business. So it's well worth going back and having a watch of that one to see if you've missed anything there, because I think that was a real goodie. All our webinars are recorded, and you can find them at evernym.com/webinars. There's a trove of really great information there for you to have a look at, everything from really deep cryptographic techniques and topics all the way up to really good case studies and talk about governance frameworks and other supporting information. Today I'm just watching the chat shooting by as well. This is amazing already. Today's session is a really important one. It's literally about the future of the web, and there have been some very interesting developments at the World Wide Web Consortium, or W3C for short. The W3C is the main international standards organization for the web, and the developments all about the proposed new Decentralized Identifier standard, or DIDS for short. And what's going on might surprise you. As usual at Evernym, we like to be really open about everything we do. So we thought, well, let's have a webinar about this. And crikey, it's amazing the amount of interest this is generated. I can't think of anyone better to talk about this fascinating situation than our own Drummond Reed and James Monaghan. So Drummond, could you give us a quick intro, please?
Yeah, thanks, Andy. So at Evernym, I'm Chief Trust Officer. It's a position that combines identity, security, and privacy, because we're all about producing trust with self-sovereign identity. And most importantly for this webinar, I'm the co-editor of the DID specification at W3C. And as we'll explain in the webinar, I've been working on this for the last 7 years of my life. So it's pretty important subject.
Thanks, Drummond. And James, over to you.
Thanks, Andy. Far less accomplished than Drummond, but I'm James Monaghan, the head of product here at Evernym. And I have the privilege of taking these standards, these specifications for DIDs and verifiable credentials, and putting them into products that we get to put in the hands of thousands and hopefully millions of end users. So that's tremendously exciting. Cool,
thanks, James. So two massive jobs there, both Drummond and James are doing. So yeah, moving on to the agenda then. This webinar is longer than our usual 1 hour. However, we'll get through the core content in about 40 minutes and then move on to audience Q&A as usual. If there's questions that come in that are pertinent to what's being discussed on screen, then we'll dive into those as well. If you need to drop on the hour or just a bit before, we will put the recording up for you to have a look at that. On the agenda today then, so we're going to kick off by explaining the controversy. What is going on? We have our reporter on the ground, Drummond Reed, who's going to tell us everything that's happening at W3C. No better person. So what's going on, who's saying what and why? We'll explain the ramifications of getting it wrong, this stuff that we're doing here at the moment. And we'll round off the formal session by covering the objections of Google, Apple, and Mozilla one by one, so stick around for that. Then we'll go to audience Q&A, which I suspect will be quite lively. We've had about 100 questions already submitted before we've even started, so it's going to be quite peachy, I think. And there's no way we'll get to all of them, but we'll do our best. I'm just watching the chat shooting past, and we've got hello from Helsinki, Pasi, hi, how you doing? Casta from Spain. Fernando's in Canada. This is absolutely incredible. I just saw somebody, we've got Imo in Bulgaria, David, hi David in Sweden. It's absolutely amazing. So thanks everyone for joining, epic stuff. So if you've got questions, then use the Zoom Q&A. Looks like we'll use the chat for just socially saying hello to everyone. If you've got any questions, put them in the Zoom Q&A, and behind the scenes, Alex grabs all those and tries to put them in some sort of order for us as well. So that will be happening as well. So I think we need to really crack on. Do note that we are recording this webinar, so that will be ready for everyone probably tomorrow. So I think what we need to do without further ado is find out from Drummond what's happening. Drummond, the floor is yours.
All right, Andy. Well, let's start out by explaining what is this controversy all about. And really, it's quite simple. I mean, the whole webinar will be describing it, but what's gone on is the DID working group at W3C started 2 years ago, and we've been through the whole cycle of everything that we needed to do, and completed the DID 1.0 spec. And it went to a vote in August at W3C. And what we show here is the Decentralized Identity Foundation, Trust ORP Foundation. Between them, they have over 350 members that are building on decentralized digital trust infrastructure. And as that represents, the vast majority of the votes were in favor of the specification of approving it as a W3C recommendation. However, at the very end of the voting period, there were three what they call formal objections, votes against advancing it DID 1.0 as a formal specification. And they happen to come from the three biggest browser vendors, Google, Apple, and Mozilla. And this really raised a lot of questions. And that's why I think we have the attendance we have today. Believe me, it's raised a lot of discussion within the W3C as well. And we'll talk about that. But there's a lot at stake here. And to talk about that, I'm going to turn it over to James.
Thanks, Drummond. So to understand why we think this is a big deal, you sort of need to look back over the history of the internet a little bit. And there have been these pivotal moments where major new standards have been introduced. And whenever that's happened, there's been a wave of innovation and opportunity that's really shaped the future of how we think about and how we use the internet. So with TCP/IP, we connected together disparate networks on a scale that simply wasn't possible or practical beforehand. With the invention of HTTP and the browser, we ushered in the era of the web and many of the applications that all of us use every single day. With mobile, then we got to bring the web in our pocket and have it with us everywhere we go. And that led to, again, just huge new opportunities, both for businesses and for individuals. But as we've moved down this path, accidentally, we've moved further and further away from that original decentralized vision of meshing together all these systems. Instead, most of our experiences online have ended up mediated by a very small number of very large platforms. And so what excites us and what we think is so pivotal about this moment in time is that this movement towards decentralization and the introduction of standards like the DID Spec represents a way to return to that original vision and with it sort of reclaim some of the soul of this whole movement. And that sounds super grandiose. To back up a bit and explain, what is a DID then, and why should you care? How is it different from a non-decentralized identifier? Think for a moment about all the different identifiers you use every single day. Think about your email address, which is something at gmail.com or whatever. Think about your phone number, which has a prefix, which was allocated by the carrier that you get your phone plan from. Think about your Twitter handle, which is just that. It's literally a Twitter handle. It's not yours, it's Twitter's. All of these identifiers you rent, not own. And a decentralized identifier is the opposite of that. Rather than being centralized in someone else's platform where you are sort of on the outside, hoping to have permission to use it according to their terms, instead, they're centralized around you, and you truly own all of them. And to think about why ownership matters, if we just go to the next slide, Drummond, ownership's important because it's about control. Like if you think about these identifiers, they represent how you are known, how you are reached, how you transact, how you interact. And so as we conduct more and more of our life online, this becomes about who controls your wallet, who controls how you prove who you are, who controls how you communicate, and who can see those communications and who you can communicate with. So it's about how you manifest on the web and who controls that. And that's why we think it is absolutely foundational to the future that we're all trying to build together.
Excellent, James. Thank you very much for really posing why this is so important. So let's for this audience in particular, some folks may not be familiar with the details of DIDs. Answer this question. So what are they? But not in any great technical depth. I'll start with this slide that Brent Zundell and I used 2 years ago when we opened the DID working group, and Evernym had a webinar on it. By the way, I want to mention Brent Zundell, Chief Cryptography Architect at Evernym, is not here with us today because he's the co-chair of the DID working group, and as such needs to maintain a neutral position and deal with all the parties on both sides of the table around this. And so Brent, or Ambassador Brent, as I call him sometimes, wanted us to tell this story here, but believe me, he's extremely involved and in conversations about this topic at the W3C every day. So in any case, for someone listening to this later on the podcast, I will actually read this definition. Decentralized identifiers are a new type of globally unique identifier, a URI, which is the standard address of everything on the World Wide Web, that does not require a centralized registration authority because control of the identifier can be proved using cryptography. And it is crypto all the way down here. Now, if you want to dive deeper into DIDs and how they actually work, our first recommendation is the previous webinar that Brent and I did, and we have the link there on the screen, and Alex, our webinar wizard, will add it to the chat. And our second recommendation is chapter 8 of this book that I co-authored, Self-Sovereign Identity. And by the way, 54 authors altogether in this. So we recommend this as a resource for going deep on all subjects about SSI. Chapter 8 here was co-written with one of my favorite people in the space, Mark Sabadello, founder and CEO of Danutech in Vienna, and who's been working with me on identifier standards for 15 years now. So that chapter will go very deep into all the things we're talking about here today, if you really want to dive down into it. But my favorite quote from that chapter is that DIDs are the atomic building block of decentralized digital trust infrastructure. And I'm going to quickly explain why. Why is that the case? In very simple terms, a DID is a digital control point. Now, what do we mean by that? Let's take exactly what James was talking about earlier. All the addresses that you use to represent yourself and communicate today. Starting with an email address, the most commonly used identifier and proof of identity on the internet today. If you think about it, where is your email address controlled? Is it on your devices where you actually use your email software or your browser? Or is it in fact out on some server at some service provider somewhere? The answer is the second one, and that means that service provider, if you somehow violate someone's terms of service, can turn you off. Now, the same is true of your phone number. As James explained, that's controlled on some servers, at some service provider somewhere. And even if you said, okay, I'm going to take control and have my own domain name with my own blog and my own website, that domain name is controlled on a DNS registry someplace. And there's a whole process at ICANN to dispute and, if necessary, take away a domain name if you've infringed on intellectual property rights or otherwise broken the terms of service. So by contrast, with a DID, as James explained, because it's decentralized, that control point is with you. It can be on any of your local devices, multiple of your local devices in digital wallets that you have on those devices. It can be someplace in the cloud in a place that you control. That's the whole point of having that control directly in your hands. Now, how does it actually give you that control? I'm going to go to this next slide. And this is my one single technical slide explaining DIDs. And if you're going to screenshot it, wait until I build the whole thing, because there's just a couple points I want to make here. So the core innovation with DID in this triangle is that every DID, and pretty soon we're going to talk about the 112 DID methods that have been registered with the working group at W3C. But every one of those methods implements this triangle. Every DID is cryptographically bound to a key pair, a public and private key. So when we say control point, we're talking about that right there. The private key behind a DID is your control over that identifier and everything you can do with that identifier. So you're looking at this and probably thinking, wait a minute, public private key cryptography, that's like 40 years old. There's what's new here, and that we're building on top of. And it turns out it's extraordinarily simple, that when you add the DID and you turn this into a triangle, you create something that never needs to change. The DID can continue and never has to change when the keys do change. Key rotation, it's one of the fundamental recommendations of good security is don't keep using the same public-private key pair for long periods of time. So this right here, this is the whole thing. DIDs in one shot. DIDs provide continuous identity for a key pair. And by the way, this doesn't have to be a single key. In many organizational and enterprise use cases, it will actually be multi-sig. There will be multiple keys associated with the DID. So multiple people need to act together to sign a document, to initiate a communication, to authenticate behind the DID. But whether it's a single key or multiple keys, this is the whole point. When you add the DID layer, you add that abstraction layer that makes that DID something that you can continue to use for life and beyond. Because every one of them is a cryptographically unique identifier. So this fundamental triangle is behind everything else we're going to talk about here today. And now I'm going to turn it back over to James to talk about, so why is it important to be in control?
Yeah, so why am I excited, right? Now that we know that these things exist, what are the benefits so that I see as a product guy? Like, in short, is because once you have this capability that Drummond's describing, once you've got identifiers that you truly own and control, you can use them anywhere and everywhere that you need to manifest yourself or your wishes online. So something as banal as logging in to something that is still an unsolved problem of universal electronic signatures for contracts and property rights and things like that. You can use it for secure communication without needing to rent your addresses from platform providers. And you can use it for financial transactions. In short, almost anything you might want to do on the web can be enabled by a DID in a way that doesn't lock you in to the traditional intermediaries and platform providers that restrict your ability to do that and actually manifest yourself as you wish to. So you can look at sort of two main categories of benefits here. For individuals, control of your identifiers means control of your data, practically speaking. It's all very well to be able to export all your content from Facebook, say, but actually, if you don't control your identifier and your social graph, all of that is useless, right? Your communications are still effectively locked in to a platform like that. If you controlled it, though, that balance is completely tipped in your favor. These are essentially identifiers which are entirely on your terms and not anyone else's. And so why should businesses want to allow you to do this? It's not just because regulations are increasingly pushing them to allow free choice and privacy and security for consumers. It's also because businesses are seeing the benefits in actually competing on being able to offer that type of equitable relationship with their end users. But the benefits are more than just altruistic. If you can offer simple, universal login that's completely secure and completely frictionless, why on earth wouldn't you? Password reset and account recovery and such like cost businesses a fortune, consumers hate it, and it doesn't work that well. So there are many reasons to consider this, even for simple use cases. But when you expand it to the full decentralized vision of the web and imagine actually, not just if I use this for one use case, but what if I use decentralized identifiers everywhere, then you can actually completely transform how you have relationships with those end users. You can connect and interact with them in a whole new way that is both more universal, but also more respectful. And we believe that that's going to unleash an absolutely enormous wave of opportunities for businesses and for consumers alike.
And James, do you want to also talk about, well, actually, no, I guess I will dive into. So where are DIDs being used today? What, I mean, this specification we're talking about is everything on the other side of that, or are we, already well into it? Well, I have for a long time said, and I thank our webinar wizard, Alex Waltz, for this fantastic graphic of the twin pillars of self-sovereign identity. VCs, if for any reason you're not familiar with that acronym, verifiable credentials. Sometimes I need to explain, it's ironic, verifiable credentials as a standard at W3C are over 2 years old. It was approved in September of 2019. DIDs are a lower layer than VCs. Someone's already asked a question about, well, weren't DIDs defined or anticipated by the verifiable credential specification? The answer is absolutely yes. I frequently actually copy out the explanation of DIDs that was included in the verifiable credential specification. The need to have portable identifiers, cryptographically verifiable identifiers for verifiable credentials that are for them to be portable, for them to be under the control of the individual or the holder of the credential was well understood. That's why the DID working group was chartered at W3C right literally the same month that the verifiable credential spec was finished. So even though it's a lower level specification, it's the other key pillar. Now, the point about how far along is this moving? One of my favorite folks in the industry, Daryl O'Donnell, who is the chair of the technical stack working group of the Trust ORP Foundation, likes to talk about premature standardization. Don't standardize something before you really know enough about how it's going to be used. Yes, standards go through versions, but really have real proof of how you're going to be using it before you go through the standardization process. That's exactly what we've been doing with DIDs. What we show here is the representation of the over 350 members of the Decentralized Identity Foundation and Trust over IP that are all working to build on top of DIDs and decentralized digital trust infrastructure. And we have a number of examples of production use around the world. And every one of these involves DIDs using a particular DID method that is being relied on in the market today for credentials that are being issued. So we won't, we have whole other webinars on most of these topics that you can find at the Evernym website. But we just wanted to make the point, this is not something that's in, speculation in the future. We have the experience, and many other companies have that experience to drive the DID specification. So let's talk about that spec now and what those objections were. So very, very quickly, what is actually covered when we were when we refer to the DID spec, okay? So there are actually 4 deliverables coming out of the DID working group at W3C. When we use the term DID Spec, we're referring to this here. It is the document that defines the syntax of DIDs, the data model for DID documents. It's the information associated with any DID that's stored in what we call a verifiable data registry of any kind. It doesn't have to be a blockchain. It can be a distributed file system, can be a conventional database if you want. It's whatever a particular DID method defines it to be. Defines them 4 required DID methods: the CRUD operations, create, read, update, and deactivate. And then a very important set of security and privacy considerations. And these are what's required in any DID method specification. The second one, very important, is the DID specification registries. This is a registry that will be maintained at W3C by the working group for DID methods, for DID document properties that can be extended, key types, and service types. Now, it's very important as we go through these objections to understand, before we even got to the vote, we have 112 DID methods that have been registered so far. So, you know, my original expectation starting on this, 7 years ago, was that by the time we got to a standard, we might have a dozen or 2 dozen, and it's an order of magnitude higher. So the next deliverable, which was part of our charter, is something called the DID method rubric, and it is we anticipated, again, we had quite a bit of experience before we even got to start the working group, evaluating the suitability of a DID method for a particular use case or a group of customers or digital trust ecosystem. It's up to that ecosystem to make that decision. What we wanted to provide was guidance about how to go about that evaluation. That's what the DID method rubric is for. It's for the market to evaluate DID methods. Huge amounts of work have gone into this. It's still being evolved. A big kudos to Joe Andrew from Legendary Requirements and Daniel Hardman as co-editor. Now Ryan Grant has stepped up. A lot of work has gone into this tool, and it's very important, these 3 things, when we go through the objections. I want to highlight these 2, the DID method registries and how it's designed to work with the DID rubric, have a lot to do with how we answer these objections. So that's what we're talking about. Very, very quickly, 5 years of work, starting in 2015, with the first discussions of how we would do, quote, blockchain identity at Internet Identity Workshop. 5 years of work went in before we finally had an approved charter in September of 2019. Again, the same month that the verifiable credentials specification was approved. So think of it as sort of part 2. Once we started the working group, this is a diagram we've been using throughout the last 2 years for the steps you go through to have in the W3C process, to go from working drafts to a candidate recommendation to a proposed recommendation, and that's what's finally voted on at W3C. We have been through all those steps, and we've fulfilled every requirement of our charter, all of what are called horizontal reviews, and the test suite that was necessary, and I think we had it was about 48 different DID methods passed the test suite before we got to the final vote of the W3C members, and that's where we had the 3 formal objections. So now let's go into what were those objections and what are our answers to each of these. Now, what I'll do is I'll explain each objection and basically, what our response is. And then if you have a question specifically about this objection, go ahead and put it in the Q&A, and we'll take a pause with each of these 4 and see if there are any questions that we can answer specifically around that before we go into the general Q&A. So, and I do want to explain, W3C votes are private. A member can make their vote public, but they're not required to. By default, they're private. So of the 3 objections, Mozilla was the only one who published their objections publicly. And these are the 4 points that they made. I want to point out the other 2, Apple and Google, basically said, yes, those things, although since then, Google has taken some pains to say, well, our objections aren't exactly the same as Mozilla's. And in fact, they were very, they've explicitly told me directly, we support the direction of decentralized identifiers. We just have some issues with interoperability. So I wanted to mention that before we go into this. So the first objection was, oh, you've got this spec, but you have 112 different methods out there and they all do it in different ways. So there's no practical interoperability of DID methods. That unfortunately completely misses the point of the specification, which is all DID methods, regardless of how they solve that cryptographic triangle, they all do it. In the end, they return the same result. They take in a DID, they output a DID document. So they're all interoperable in a way that is not true of other identifier systems. So secondly, because we needed to define what we call the generic structure and operations of all DIDs, when we chartered at W3C, we explicitly, we discussed, should we take a very small set of very, very universal DID methods? And that was not allowed in the charter. They said, no, your charter is just to write the generic specification. You are not, it's out of scope to define any DID methods. And we agreed with that in the charter because the whole idea of DIDs is we define the generic overall specification and DID method specification authors, whatever they want to do, however they want to tackle it, that's their job. And they do that in their own specifications, exactly the way it works with URIs and URNs. And thirdly, each individual DID method establishes in its specification how interoperability works for that method. And so any DID method can, and many DID methods do have multiple interoperable implementations. Those that will survive over time, of course, it'll be just like multiple implementations of other internet protocols, HTTP, SMTP, you name it. Each DID method will have multiple implementations. So I'll stop there and see, Andy, are there any questions we've got?
Yeah, there's a couple of really pertinent ones, actually. Philip Bloom has said, all the theory is nice. He says he's on the side of Mozilla and will vote against the DID implementation. Oh, I've just lost the question. Hang on a minute. Oh, did you delete it? Maybe in that case, I should hold on. I think it's fair to, if someone's deleted the question. Okay, well, let's come on to John West's one. Have any of the objectors replied to our response to objection number 1? So, have you got any replies yet? Is this the first outing of these objections? So,
Mozilla, again, published their objections publicly, and that began a dialogue and a series of threads on the public mailing list for the DID working group. So you can see a lot of discussion. Within a few hours, we had the initial reactions, and then within a few days, we had dozens of responses to these. That's now being compiled. There was a meeting that the W3C arranged. We'll talk a little bit more about the process at the end. Between the objectors and the supporters of the specification to discuss, was there a way to work through the objections such that we wouldn't have to prolong the process. And the short answer was no. The objectors felt strong about their objections, and the DID working group felt strongly about moving forward the specification. I don't have it right here in front of me, but the DID working group is a public mailing list of W3C, and we will be publishing additional information. There is also information in the Trust over IP and the Decentralized Identity Foundation published a joint letter in support of the DID specification, and there's some additional information there.
Thanks, Drummond. So more to come on that. And Philip's just said he didn't delete the question, but there was a fat finger from James that made it look like it was deleted. Very funny in the chat saying, well, you can't delete it because, you know, is it on the blockchain? But anyway, let's not worry about that. So let's try Philip again. He says, all the theory is nice. You'd vote against it in its current form. I'm not going to implement 2,000 different methods. There's also a question about energy, but we'll come on to that energy use as well. Why don't you design it in a way so as not to have so many methods, so that the DLTs have to write an adaptation layer for this one common standard?
Well, I would actually...
It's where the adaptation layer is going to be, I suppose, John, isn't it? Is it?
Well, I mean, DIDs are the abstraction layer. I want to repeat again, even though we're not going to go deep into the technology here, but the DID spec basically says this is the format, the generic format for a DID for any DID method, right? Just as we have a URI spec for the generic format of a URI for any type of URI, HTTP or SMT, mail to or file or whatever. And then others write the specifications for those specific methods. But unlike URIs or URNs, for those who are familiar with those, persistent identifiers, all DID methods produce the same output, which is a DID document. And that DID document will contain the public key and or any other cryptographic metadata or what we call service endpoints for interacting with the entity that's identified, be it a person or an organization or a thing of some kind. So DIDs, I would argue, are that abstraction layer, and every DID method is just another way of something competing in the market to be the implementation that folks would choose to say, I trust that one for my usage. Yeah.
So the proliferation of methods is actually healthy as opposed to unhealthy, and the DID method is itself the abstraction. All right, let's crack on to the next one, John. Objection number 2. Hit us with objection number 2.
And now we're going to get deeper into, in fact, that very question, because the second objection was to say, oh, well, your design actually encourages divergence of DID methods instead of convergence into a small number. Now, first of all, I just explained why the DID specification is the common abstraction for all DID methods. Now, I don't mean to trivialize it, because every DID method essentially defines its own protocol for interacting with whatever that backend system is, and we call it generically a verifiable data registry. And it can be a blockchain, as I said. It can be distributed file system. It can be a DHT. It can be just a distributed database of some kind. It can be in Microsoft's case, they're using Active Directory as a verifiable data registry. Not for their ION method, that's different, but all of those can serve in the back end. In every case, what you return is a DID document. So all DIDs use what we call a DID resolver, and you give it a DID and you get back a DID document as output, just the way with DNS, you give it a domain name, you get back a DNS record. So, there is a difference between DID methods, but it's much smaller than people think. And the practical question of interoperability is, okay, well, how many DID methods will need to be implemented in order for for two different parties using two different DID methods to be able to communicate or authenticate?
That's exactly what Gabriel is asking. He's saying you didn't present an argument for the interoperability at the DID method level, as opposed to like DIDs themselves. So you can have lots and lots of DID methods, I suppose, and they're not interoperable. Well,
so the point is, each DID method, regardless of how it's implemented, will produce the same result through a DID resolver. Now, I want to point out, at the Decentralized Identity Foundation, there's a project called the Universal Resolver, and you can plug in different DID methods. I don't know exactly how many. I think last time I talked to Marcus Sabadello, I mentioned heads up that project. I think it's roughly half of the 112 DID methods have been implemented at the Universal Resolver. And you can go use that today. You can just Google diff Universal Resolver and go try out its sandbox right now. So the key point we're after here, Andy, is that at the outset, when we charted the DID working group, our view was the market should be determining the success of DID methods, just like with URL schemes or URL namespaces. And I like to point out to folks, as of earlier this week when I checked, 345 different URI schemes and 70 URN namespaces, those are the terms used, are registered with IANA. So if you and again, it's apples and oranges to compare these. Those are all generic identifier schemes along with DIDs. But URI schemes have totally different implementations. URN schemes, totally different implementations. They return different things. With DIDs, they all return a DID document. They all solve the same problem. So, having 112 ways to solve that problem from which the market can choose, and we do believe it's going to be a power law and a small number of DID methods will be very widely used. That's how the market works. And the last point we want to make is with these other two, URNs and URIs, they're all based on federated registries and the domain name space or other types of registries like DOI for URNs. So DIDs are decentralized. Every DID method is a solution to that DID triangle, and therefore innovation is what we want to pursue at the edges. Okay, and any other questions right around this one?
Yeah, there's a question from Philip Long. Why does the marketplace think all methods need to be implemented? I think that's kind of generic, as in marketplace, but there's no requirement that says thou must implement every DID method, right? There'll be ones that bubble up to the top and other more esoteric ones for particular uses, I guess.
Absolutely. Just to clarify something, the DID 1.0 specification from W3C defines the generic requirements to have a conformant DID, the actual identifier, and a conformant DID method specification. We can literally say, and if you want to be listed in the registry, we have, again, 112 listed before we finalize the specification. We're working right now to say, okay, now that we have a final specification, those 112 DID methods, how many of them have a compliant? We're actually, what I've been advocating is all 112 have to come back and say, all right, now we're going to update our specification so it's compliant with all the requirements, and there are more requirements in the final spec. And then only those that meet that will be listed in that registry, or they'll be marked as, okay, you're a 1.0 compliant method. And we're discussing, and do you have, are you in production? Do you have a test suite? Are you in a standardization process, or have you become a standard, so that all that information is available in the registry? That will make it much easier to make the baseline assumptions. But Andy, this leads us right into the next question. So let's go there now, because we're gonna be in this dialogue for the rest of the webinar. The third objection was that Mozilla pointed out was, well, wait a minute, you said these are decentralized identifiers, but in your registry, you're not prohibiting centralized DID methods. And there are certainly several methods in there that some have said, well, that's controlled by a single company. So here's our response. First and foremost, by decentralization, it doesn't just mean architectures, it means that's where innovation happens. So some of us at the outset, we were skeptical. Was W3C even the right place to take, a standard like DIDs? We were convinced by folks, and I'll give credit to Manny Sporny and Dave Longley at Digital Bazaar. They had been working with W3C for some time and said, no, verifiable credentials standardized there. We know DIDs are needed. Bring them to W3C. Let's do the work there. They believe in decentralization. So, but I think you can appreciate, it really would be a travesty if decentralized identifiers of all the innovation is the choke point is a centralized registry where they get to say, yes, you're in or out, right? So I want to point out that registry is there. to differentiate between DID methods, to find a way to locate them, and to encourage them to use separate DID method namespaces, so they're globally unique. But there's no ultimate requirement. The W3C nor the DID working group can enforce that. Now, we actually think that's the whole point. Is it's not our job or the W3C's job to judge DID methods. That's what the market can do, and it can do it more efficiently and more effectively. And now I really want to underscore that's why we did the DID method rubric. And that document is grown in sophistication. It's something we worked on all along over the 2 years, but in the last few months, it's grown enormously in importance. And it is specifically a document we authored to help market participants evaluate DID methods. So we see the market. I mean, we see multiple Trust over IP, Decentralized Identity Foundation, EFF. Whoever wants to go in and say, all right, let's look at the DID methods. Let's look at which ones have superior security, which ones have superior availability, which ones are the most decentralized by the criteria used to measure that, which ones are the most environmentally sustainable. That's what the market can evaluate, and they can do it more effectively again than W3C.
Okay. Let's go straight to number 4, Drummond, shall we? As we're getting short on time. So
all right, then we'll finish up here. The last one is this question. Mozilla said, DID methods that use proof of work blockchains harmful to the environment? So again, the DID method, the DID specification does not specify any DID methods. We don't say anything about how a DID method goes to implement itself. So those are choices made by DID method specifications in their own, and it's out of scope. So this is really is somewhat of a red herring because we don't have any direct control over that. This is a perfect example of one of the criteria in the DID method rubric, and that is actively being worked on based on this feedback from this objection. And there's a link that Alex can put in the chat to a whole W3C issue that anyone with in GitHub can comment on about that. And lastly, it's another example of why the market should be choosing and using decentralized market competition to decide about DID methods. All right, I think that that wraps up. We're going to keep talking about this in the Q&A. Do we should we hit the final slides, Andy?
Yeah, I think so. Let's do the last couple of slides and then go on to the Q&A bit. Yeah.
Got it. Okay, so anyway, I think everyone listening understands we really deeply believe the future of the web is decentralized, and that DIDs are inevitable. And so a few points here. If you're concerned, oh, this means DIDs are not going to move forward, no, a lot of folks are working hard to complete this process at W3C. Because Tim Berners-Lee is no longer directly day-to-day active as director, the W3C management is delegated to work through formal objections like this. And just a reality of it, very few of these formal objections are ultimately sustained. You just have to take time to resolve them, and usually a specification moves forward. The progress of DIDs, as we already explained, is unstoppable. This is a quote from James: "Genie's not going back in the bottle." All right. This does not affect our products or customers at all. We are still charging ahead with DID-based innovation. And the real ultimate lesson here is this is a shift in control. And it is from, big tech out to the edges, back to people, back to organizations, back to the things that they need to be involved with. So we ironically think this controversy ends up being a very strong signal that this shift is finally happening for real. And I'll leave you, before we go into Q&A, with this final quote that really is how I would sum up the whole situation. DIDs are the innovation that democratizes cryptography so that everyone can use it, not just big companies or enterprises with servers that can, afford HTTP extended certificates, HTTPS certificates, TLS, but all of us in all of our communications, we can have the protection and the control, you know, anti-phishing, and really get at some of the deep security and privacy issues of the web. So that's over to Q&A, Andy.
Yeah, well, crikey, we're going to be busy. So that's really good, Drummond. Thanks very much. Do you want to just kill the screen share for a sec, and we'll come to the Q&A. Okay, so the first one, and we had a whole bunch of questions come in, and the chat's been epic, by the way. You know, everyone's just sort of self-provisioning on the chat and answering each other's questions. We love that. Really good community here. So here we go. So why did these three fierce competitors kind of come together on this? Have they done anything like this before? Has been anything like this happened previously? And do you think they objected with malicious intent, or did they just not read the spec properly?
Okay, there are two questions there. I'll answer the first one because that's a simple factual one. So Manus Morning, one of the co-editors of the spec, did some research and revealed that actually it's the first time that multiple browser vendors have ever filed a formal objection against the specification. So this is quite unusual that 3 of them would be the only 3 to object. And again, W3C votes are private, but what I'll say generally is that an order of magnitude more W3C members voted in favor. So it really again, it resulted in this very strange sense of, oh, why is this? We in the Evernym blog post, we didn't want to speculate directly on their motivations or reasons, so we just listed some of what we thought were relevant factors. I have received quite a bit of feedback on well, you're speculating, or you're thinking that they are being nefarious or intimating that. That's not what we intended. And again, I want to reinforce Google in particular. Their W3C representative responded to me directly in a discussion on the advisory committee list. We are supportive of the direction of decentralized identifiers. We have these issues with interoperability. Now, those 4 things that we talked about, at least the first 3, I do think come from not really understanding the architecture and you know, the goal of decentralization and market evaluation of DID methods.
Yeah, and it is fairly complex under the skin, isn't it? And you do need to, you know, you've been in it for 7 years, and you just think everyone knows this stuff, don't they, Drummond, right? But in actual fact, it is really complicated. So hopefully those ways of overcoming the objections hopefully will help things along a bit. So we've got another million questions, so we'll do as many as we can do. Yeah, so timelines, Greg Ryan, what are the timelines? Should we be worried? Do we just carry on anyway? You know, what happens if it doesn't get approved? And Daryl made a really good comment in chat, which is saying we don't need Web 2 companies' permission for this, right? But you know, yeah, I want to strongly reinforce a couple points there. First of all, we are very actively working this. All the members of the DID working group at the W3C annual TPAC meeting that was virtual 2 weeks ago. Jeff Jaffe, the CEO of the W3C, met with us for an hour to answer our questions about the process going forward. Again, because Tim Berners-Lee has stepped into the backseat, W3C management is now implementing processes for what they call director-free, and so therefore there's going to be a council that comes together at W3C to work through the formal objection. The process is going to take a while. I would actually, it's not just going to be weeks. It may be even a couple months to get to a final. It's not stopping. It's not stopping innovation, right? We're seeing
that
more
was
and more projects.
My second point
everywhere.
was not at all. We've been standardizing what, you know, we want to reinforce the power and the utility of DIDs in the market by reaching that level of standardization. But no, implementations and products are moving as fast as ever. Yeah,
we got my good friend Phil Graham from the NHS has said, when do you think the issues will be resolved and we can move forward? Relying parties can't be delayed by product motivations. So I think there's a worry about delaying if the products are still going to be done. So the Earth doesn't end if W3C doesn't do something, but you're optimistic it'll all get sorted out anyway, Drummond, one way or the other.
Very, very optimistic. Again, research shows that very few formal objections in the end are sustained. The number is very small. Yeah. And I think, ironically, the amount of attention that those 3 objections have brought to this issue, they won't accelerate the process, but I think they are helping educate W3C members as to just how important DIDs are to the future of the decentralized web. Yeah.
So I think in the English expression, keep calm and carry on is probably the best way to describe it. Okay, so here was one that came in from Sir Knight, or Sir Knight. To make DIDs pretty and memorable, won't we eventually need a central index to make sort of AX3 blah, blah, blah become myblog.crypto or James at Evernym or something? So that's a kind of interesting one, isn't it? Because people aren't going to see DIDs and write them down to each other, I don't think, really, are they? So
yeah, can I go?
Yeah, James, yeah, crack on. Yeah, so this is the product question, right? How do you use these things anyway?
So I guess, first of all, I think there are DID methods that allow for human readable names, for sure. Like there's nothing about the spec that prohibits that completely, but there's a good reason why most of the implementations don't go that way, and it's because of Zuko's triangle. Basically, it's because actually, if you want to have proper privacy here, you want to discourage reusing an identifier across all of your different interactions, because then you're leaving the same unique fingerprint, the same digital breadcrumb across all of your different interactions, and that is how these giant monopolies have been built up in the first place. But from a usability perspective, like, of course you want to be discoverable. It's just that you want it to be on your terms. And so DIDs will mostly exist under the hood. They will be invisible to end users. And you'll have software agents that work for you that create them on the fly. You'll have many hundreds of them. But the layer above that, there'll be separate services that, with your permission and according to your express beliefs and wishes on privacy, will allow you to be discoverable by your friends, by third-party services, by commercial interests that may want to reach out for you. And so they need to be separate. Like, they're closely related, but pushing those 2 things together into your identifier is what led to many of these issues where we are all locked in with our phone number, our Twitter handle, etc., and we're all subject to deplatforming by the people who control those things.
And the other thing about DIDs that people often don't realize is they do allow 2-way verification of who's at the other end, right? It's not just a 1-way thing. And I think it's probably worth pointing that out, that well, you could say, hey, here I am, come and find me, but you can also verify who's asking you for something, right?
Yeah,
go ahead.
Yeah,
James, okay. Yeah, confident. James, it's all yours. I'm comparing this thing, James.
Yeah, well, no, because I mean that is exactly right. And you can do it because there's a DID on either end of these interactions. Yeah. And it's worth noting, actually, when we talked about interoperability earlier, we were talking, literally at the DID method level, like how can I swap out which DID methods we use? We didn't really talk on, all right, I've got 2 DIDs now, how do I communicate with them? And there's a whole other family of specs that are used for that. Go look up DIDCOM, we'll put some links in the chat. But yeah, basically there's a DID on either end of an interaction. And so if you dealt with someone before, then you know what the DID is, they can cryptographically prove that they still control it, so you're good. If you haven't dealt with someone before, then how do you build that trust? Well, that's where verifiable credentials come in, right? And so the complementary spec, the second pillar that Drummond mentioned earlier on in the presentation, that's how you're able to bring trust from a different domain into that relationship that you're trying to establish there, and imbue that new DID, which no one has ever seen before, with the aspects of your reputation that you want to use for that interaction.
Yeah, yeah. So in terms of prettifying DIDs, I mean, they're going to be things like QR codes, right? But the DID doesn't imply trust. It gives you a dial tone, and then you have the credentials that give you the trust on top, right?
That's right.
In both directions, which is really important. Okay, Drummond, I'm going to come to you on this one.
Okay.
This is from Greg Ryan. From what I understand, Microsoft is supporting the DID SSI standardization ratification by W3C. Who else is supporting this? Any other large companies or institutions? So yeah, Microsoft is big into DIDs, aren't they?
Yes, and actually, I want to clarify something there. It's very important. When Mozilla first went public with its objection, it mentioned this is shared by some other W3C members, and they mentioned Apple and Microsoft, which unfortunately a number of people interpreted that Microsoft had also objected to the specification. That is completely untrue. There's at W3C, you can actually do 5 different types of votes, all from like totally in favor, just go, to this formal objection, no, do not advance the work at all. Microsoft did the one which is, oh no, we're in favor, but we have a few suggestions we want you to take into account.
Right.
And so no, they were. The other point is, of the 4 major browser vendors, Microsoft was the only one who was actually engaged in the work as part of the W3C. And Daniel Buckner and Pam Dingle, the head of identity standards, and Mike Jones, who a lot of folks might know has a huge history with the Jose standards, they were in there because Microsoft has been very serious about DIDs and decentralized identity infrastructure. So I would just want to point out, yes, but besides that, yes, there are a number of large companies, and in most cases, the entry is verifiable credentials. IBM, for example, the IBM Health Pass that's, been out in the press, and the, there are many efforts in blockchain. They've actually implemented DIDs on multiple blockchains. So there are many more examples, I think, as it gets out there. The DID is the IP address of the next layer of the web. And so every large company is going to be on top of it. At Cisco, note.
Yeah, that's the thing, isn't it? So the next generation of identifiers with a huge bunch of benefits. So as James says, it's inevitable. Here's a question from our good friend, anonymous attendee, who's been on every webinar we've done so far. Probably chuck this one at James, actually. Is there a concern that DIDs will be baked into the OSs of mobile device makers? That's an interesting one, isn't it?
First of all, I want to applaud anonymous attendee on rejecting the tyranny of Zoom's insistence that he identify themselves, or she identify herself. Brilliant. That's exactly what we're here to talk about. Is there a risk? Gosh, I mean, I think, is there a possibility? Absolutely. I actually wouldn't characterize it as a risk at all. I mean, I think if the standard is implemented properly, then having that baked in at the operating system level and made available in the pocket of billions of people is a fantastic opportunity, because it allows you to take the ubiquity of those services and bake in this truly decentralized peer-to-peer privacy infrastructure that Drummond was talking to us about. And just imagine the services that can be built on top of that. So I think it is a likely future outcome, and we believe that getting this spec fully ratified as a standard is a really important step along that journey. So we hope this will usher that in.
Yeah, very cool.
I want to add to that, Andy, that I
totally
agree. It's one of the reasons you do pursue a full, W3C standard. Dan Brickley is very helpfully, being extremely experienced with the W3C process, put in a link in the chat to that process. And I want to reinforce to anyone listening to this webinar, everything being done here is being done to W3C process. It is any member's prerogative to object at any point up to the end of a recommendation. And so, Google, Apple, and Mozilla haven't done anything wrong here, right? They have just simply said, okay, we have these concerns. And what it's engendered is a very healthy and, a debate and discussion around them. We're trying to do our best here to educate everyone in the market and other W3C members that are not nearly as close to this as the DID working group about why we feel we have met all the requirements. And it's actually, in everyone's best interest, W3C and the members and the market, to standardize this piece so we can move forward with the market, the survival of the fittest of DID methods.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, isn't it? It's going from lots of possible DID methods to the best will emerge and market forces, etc. But there's nobody forcing everyone to adopt a certain DID method, right? It's
absolutely not. That's where the market needs to compete. And again, the whole idea of decentralization and innovation at the edges is let the market do that and do it most efficiently.
Yeah, agree. Anonymous has come back and just said if it's baked in and not proprietary competing implementation. Yeah, so if you've got like proper DIDs at the OS level, that's got to be good for adoption if it's done properly, right? I would think.
But if it's good enough, right? If it's sort of decentralized lipstick on a centralized pig, then we got right. So I think that might be what our friend is getting at, and something that we know that many of these companies actually want the same benefits for consumers, and they just have a different opinion about how to get there. And we absolutely respect that. But yeah, there is a concern that the sheer scale at which something like that could be pushed out to market might all these efforts.
Yeah, I mean, we've already seen quite a lot of SSI washing, haven't we, or DID washing? Oh yeah, I'm decentralized, and actually no, not at all. And there is a kind of pull the wool over people's eyes. So I like that's analogy of the lipstick on the pig there, James. Epic. Drummond.
This is perhaps the most important point in this entire webinar. Whatever you do, ladies and gentlemen out there, do not let anyone, any vendor, anyone else control your DIDs, right? You need to have control, and they need to be portable. So I like to point out, we are using digital wallets on these devices today. Whether it's Apple or Google or Samsung or whatever it is, they all have digital wallets, but they are not open standard, and your credentials in that wallet are not portable. We're talking not just about credentials, but about the DIDs, those keys, those control points. Now, you don't actually want to move keys between secure hardware enclaves, but your ability to move needs to be in your hands. And that's the most important thing about the digital wallets, what I call the wallet wars is, even if it moves down to the OS, you need to be able to move and keep control of your DIDs.
Yeah, excellent, very good. I think we're going to probably wrap up. We'll just do another couple. I'm just searching through the millions of questions we have here to pick out some pertinent ones. But there was a really good one early on about peer DIDs, actually, saying they don't need anything other than the two parties involved. Just asking for a bit of a clarification on peer DIDs. I think it's worth just doing that quickly, Drummond. And what are peer DIDs, and why don't they need any sort of central trust registry or any other trust registry?
I love that you've asked that question. Some great quotes coming in the chat here.
I know, I'm just looking at centralized wolf in decentralized clothing from Phil Graham.
Yeah. I just put in a link to the peer DID method specification, and I love to point out that initially, the whole idea, DIDs are going to be, they're going to be backed. You're going to prove control of your DID and keep it portable by having, having it registered on a blockchain. That's fine. Most of the early DID methods were there, but then there was a collective aha about 2 years ago. Wait a minute, this cryptographic triangle is just as useful in a peer-to-peer situation where you never have to reveal the DID anywhere. If you read one specification coming out of this, one DID method specification, read the peer DID spec. It's got over a dozen contributors. It's been at the Decentralized Identity Foundation for over a year now. That is what's implemented. Evernym has implemented many others. It is at the heart. In fact, it's sort of been subsumed now into the DIDCOM spec. So the default. Go ahead, Andy.
Yeah, I was going to say all of our products automatically use that approach anyway. DIDs are created pairwise for a new relationship on the fly by both parties, right? And it's tremendously powerful. We better move on to the next one. Actually,
sure.
Just pick out another one. So the chat. So I keep getting distracted by the chat because there's some epic dry wit going on in there. So talking about vendor lock-in, I think one of the issues here, guys, is that unless you know some of this like deep detail, how is somebody going to know if they've got lipstick on a centralized pig, right? How are they going to know? And maybe it goes back to our safe credentials stuff. So James, are there some kind of clues for people who are looking at vendors and looking at this market and saying, have I got a pig or not a pig?
Gosh, that's going to stick, isn't it? That one. Yeah. So, are there clues? Well, look, as you're asking that question, I had not entirely positive flashbacks to like the early days of Web 2, where people used to have those little HTML 3.0 compliant like buttons on their web page, right? And you could click that, and the official W3C verifier would go and say, "Yep, sure enough, this is a standards compliant page." And nobody except geeks like you or I would ever click that button. So, yeah. Did that help the average end user? No, but did having a trust mark like that and a body like the W3C that had a clear, crisp definition of what it means to be standards compliant and helps people prove that they are, did that help everyone rally behind it? And so things like interactive websites and JavaScript and all these other things, they could become the foundation of all the great applications we use today? Yes, I think so. So, as an end user, I am probably not going to go and audit these things. But I benefit, and we all benefit today from the fact that there are people that will, and the market is large. And if we allow for, thanks to open standards and open source and standards bodies, if we allow this peer review and we allow market forces to separate out the people who are compliant from the people who aren't, then I still get all those benefits, even if I'm not skilled enough to go and verify it myself.
Yeah. I think that's a good.
It's could I think, if I was going to summarize.
Yeah, that's the key thing. You've got the ability to test this stuff, haven't you? Which is really important. I know you want to get in, Drummond, but I think we're going to have to hang up on this one because we're quite way over. I like Philip's comment. The DID rubric is the lipstick remover. Nice, like that one, Philip. And I think there's quite a few questions throughout about Kerry as well, Drummond. And I think we should do a Kerry webinar because, there's this sort of strange acronym that's emerged, and we could probably do with helping people understand a bit more about Kerry. So, Alex, maybe we could slot in a Kerry webinar in there somewhere. Okay, so I think we're gonna wrap at this point. Thanks to the 172 of you that are still on listening to the Q&A and chucking in questions left, right, and centre, which is epic, really good. This has been fantastic, biggest webinar so far. Really enjoy the all the chat going on and people helping each other out, which is fantastic. Really good questions as well. So the recording of this will go on evernym.com/webinars. Keep an eye out for that and link to it and promote it. Click like and subscribe. Can we do that? Yeah, if you can help to get the message out there, that would be fantastic for us as all. There were a few people said, how can we help? Philippe, just give me a shout and we'll tell you how you can help with that. Keep an eye out for the recording. Next one coming up, we haven't announced it yet. We've had quite a bit of prep to do for this one, as you can imagine, but we'll get the next one announced pretty soon. I'd like to thank you all, and particularly Drummond and James, for all your epically hard work on this, keeping the thing going, keeping it alive, and it looks like we're going to have a really positive outcome from this. So a bit of controversy, I think we'll get a good result. So on that positive note, thanks very much to Drummond and James, and thanks very much to you, the audience, for coming as well and making it so good. Thanks a lot. See you on the next one. Cheers.